Please, my father will give you anything. The biggest one just laughed. Your father's time for paying is over, little lady. Now a man named Brennan is gonna pay double, and you'll work it off in his saloon till you ain't pretty no more. He shoved her hard into the dirt. Victoria knew exactly what kind of work they meant. Then, a single gunshot cracked across the plain. The man driving the wagon folded over and dropped without a sound. A voice, calm as Sunday morning, rolled in from the distance. Let the lady go. A man on a chestnut horse, silver star gleaming on his chest. U.S. Marshal Ethan Daniels. It's 3 against 1, lawman, her captor yelled. You ain't that good? The marshal's rifle didn't waver. I've seen worse odds. Y'all feeling lucky? What Victoria didn't know. This marshal had been hunting the man who sent these kidnappers for 5 long years. Ever since that same monster took his little sister, and she chose death over the life they forced on her. Now he's found his chance for justice. And she's the key to everything. This story reminds us that sometimes our darkest moments lead us to exactly where we're meant to be. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to stand anyway. And that love built in fire can last a lifetime. If you believe that the worst day of your life might be leading you to the best one, this story is for you. Drop A in the comments if you're staying until the end. Share this with someone who needs to believe that rescue can come when you least expect it. And if you want more stories where justice wins and love conquers all, subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll see you on the trail. Please, Victoria whispered, her voice raw. My father will give you anything. The biggest one just laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. Your father's time for paying is over, little lady. Now a man named Brennan is gonna pay double and you'll work it off in his saloon till you ain't pretty no more. He shoved her and she fell hard. As they hauled her up, a single sharp crack echoed across the plain. The man driving the wagon just folded over and dropped into the dust without a sound. The 3 holding Victoria froze solid, their hands flying to their pistols. A voice, calm as a Sunday morning, rolled in from the distance. Let the lady go. Victoria twisted to see a man on a big chestnut horse, sitting tall against the sun. You couldn't see his face much, but the silver star on his vest caught the light. This ain't your business, Daniels, one of her captors yelled, his voice shaky. I'm making it my business, the rider said, his voice never getting any louder. Now you can cut her loose and walk away, or you can join your partner there in the dirt. Your choice. The fellow holding her chuckled, but it sounded nervous. It's 3 against 1, lawman. You ain't that good. The rider, Daniels, urged his horse a few steps closer, a rifle resting easy in his arms. I've seen worse odds. Y'all feeling lucky? It happened in a flash. One of them pulled his gun, but a shot from the rider's rifle laid him out flat before he could even aim. The other 2 started shooting wild, and Victoria dropped to the ground, covering her head. That rider, Daniels, was off his horse in a single smooth move, taking cover behind a big rock as bullets chewed up the dirt around him. 2 more shots rang out from his spot, and another of the men hollered, grabbing his shoulder as he went down. The last one, left standing, panicked. He grabbed Victoria, yanking her up to use as a shield and pressing a cold pistol to her head. Back off, Daniels, or she's gone. Victoria squeezed her eyes shut, ready for the end. You won't get the chance, a steady voice said, suddenly right next to her. Her eyes flew open. Daniels was standing not 5 feet away. He'd somehow circled clean around them in all the noise. Before the man could even turn his head, the butt of the marshal's pistol came down hard. The man's grip went slack, and he crumpled like an empty sack. A pair of strong hands caught Victoria before she could fall. She looked up into the kindest green eyes she had ever seen, set in a face tanned by the sun. Are you all right, Miss Harlow? He asked, already cutting the ropes from her wrists. I think so, she stammered, rubbing her sore skin. How did you know my name? He gave her a small, reassuring smile. U.S. Marshal Ethan Daniels. Your father's been tearing this territory apart looking for you. When I heard the Watson gang was sniffing around Humboldt, I had a hunch. My father sent you? She asked, still in shock. Not directly, Ethan said, leading her toward his horse. But the reward poster he put up got my attention. He glanced over at the two wounded men who were groaning on the ground. They'll answer to a judge in Carson City. The Watson gang has caused enough trouble out here. Ethan helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. The solid feel of his chest at her back was the first time she had felt safe in what seemed like a lifetime. Thank you, she said, her voice barely a whisper, as they started back toward town. I'm just doing my job, Miss Harlow, he rumbled, his voice close to her ear. Victoria, she said. After all this, please call me Victoria. There was a short pause. All right, Victoria. And you can call me Ethan. As they rode with the two prisoners trailing behind, Victoria leaned back against him, worn out clear to the bone. They reached Humboldt just as the sun was touching the mountains. Folks started coming out of their houses, pointing and whispering. It's the Harlow girl. The marshal found her. We'll head to the sheriff's office first, Ethan said quietly, guiding the horse through the growing crowd. Sheriff Morgan Thompson met them at the jailhouse door, a wide grin spreading across his face when he saw Victoria. Thank heaven, he said, helping her down. Your father's been about to lose his mind with worry. The Watson gang had her, Ethan explained as he dismounted. The fourth one didn't make it. The sheriff nodded grimly. We'll take care of these two. He looked at Victoria with concern. Are you hurt, child? I'm all right, she insisted, though she ached all over. I just want to see my father. Just then a cry came from down the street. Victoria! She turned and saw her father running toward them, his face a mess of relief and joy. He was a tall man, but at that moment he looked like the biggest thing in the whole world. With hair turning to silver, and kind eyes now wide with a mix of relief and lingering terror, James Harlow saw his daughter. Father! Victoria cried out, running to him. He caught her in a bone-deep hug, holding on tight like she might just disappear into thin air. My girl, he whispered into her hair. My precious girl. When I got back from the bank and saw the store torn all to pieces and you gone... His voice cracked with the memory. Victoria just held on to him, the tears finally coming. I'm all right, Father. Marshal Daniels, he saved me. James looked past his daughter to Ethan, who was standing back, giving them their space. Marshal, he said, his voice heavy with gratitude. I don't know how I can ever thank you enough. Ethan simply tipped the brim of his hat. No thanks needed, Mr. Harlow. A man's got to do what's right. Please, James insisted, one arm still wrapped around Victoria. Come to our home. The reward I offered is yours, and then some. And then... Ethan shook his head. I didn't take this job for the money, sir. But I would like to talk with you both, after Miss Harlow has had a moment to catch her breath. I have a feeling these fellas weren't working on their own. Sheriff Thompson stepped up then. The marshal's right. The Watson gang usually rides 5 or 6 deep. If there are others, they won't be happy their plans went sideways. A fresh wave of fear washed over James Harlow's face. You think they might come back for Victoria? It's something we have to consider, Ethan said with a serious tone. At least until we figure out why they came for your daughter in the first place. Victoria couldn't help but shiver, remembering one of the men mentioning a fella named Brennan who was paying for her. Her father's arm tightened around her. Then you'll stay with us, Marshal, James said, in a way that left no room for argument. We've got plenty of space, and I'll rest easier knowing you're nearby until this whole mess is settled. Ethan paused for a second, glancing between the father and his daughter. Victoria found herself holding her breath, hoping he'd say yes. Having his steady presence around made her feel safer than she could rightly explain. All right then, Ethan finally agreed. Let me help the sheriff get these fellas locked up, and I'll be along shortly. As Victoria and her father headed toward their house on the edge of town, she couldn't resist looking back at the tall outline of Marshal Daniels. He was talking with Sheriff Thompson, looking sharp and watchful. "He rode in yesterday," her father said, noticing her gaze. "Started asking all sorts of questions about you and the store. Said he'd been trailing the Watson gang for months and figured they might be heading this way." Victoria frowned. "But why us? We're not rich folks." A dark look crossed her father's face. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I'm sure fixin' to find out." Their house was a simple two-story place right behind the store with a little garden. Victoria took care of herself. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, who had been like a mother to Victoria since her own passed 10 years ago, met them at the door, fussing over her immediately. "Look at you, child, all bruised up and dirty. What did those heathens do?" She guided Victoria inside, already yelling for hot water for a bath. Victoria let herself be led upstairs, feeling the exhaustion finally hit her like a ton of bricks. As Mrs. Winters helped her out of her ripped dress, Victoria saw her reflection in the mirror. She looked like a stranger, a wild-haired woman with a split lip, a dark bruise on her cheek, and eyes that looked far older than her 22 years. "It's all over now," Mrs. Winters said softly. "You're home safe." Victoria nodded, but she had a gut feeling that this was far from over. After a long soak, she put on a plain blue cotton dress and brushed her long brown hair until it shined. She still felt shaky, but she was determined to look put together when she saw Marshal Daniels again. When she came downstairs, her father and the marshal were sitting in the parlor, their conversation stopping the moment she entered. Ethan stood up right away, and Victoria was once again struck by how tall he was and the quiet strength he seemed to carry. He'd taken off his hat and gun belt, and his dark hair was a little damp. "Miss Harlow," he said, his green eyes noticing her cleaned-up appearance. "You're looking a whole lot better." "Thank you, Marshal Daniels," she answered, sitting on the sofa across from him. "I'm feeling more like myself." Her father cleared his throat. "The marshal's been telling me some mighty unsettling things, Victoria. It seems you being taken wasn't just some random act." Victoria's hands clenched in her lap. "I figured as much. One of them said a man named Brennan was paying them." Ethan gave a grim nod. "Clayton Brennan. He runs a string of saloons and other businesses from Carson City to Elko. He's been trying to set up shop here in Humboldt, but your father and the town council have turned down his applications." "So this was his revenge," Victoria said, feeling sick to her stomach. "That's part of it," Ethan confirmed. "But Brennan is also known for getting his hands on pretty young women for his businesses, one way or another." James Harlow's face turned red with rage. "That animal was going to force my daughter into that life just to get back at me." Ethan's expression was as hard as stone. "That's how it looks. Brennan is slick. He uses men like the Watsons to do his dirty work. But I've been building a case against him for months. Your daughter's story could be the very thing that puts him away for good." Victoria sat there, letting it all sink in. "You want me to stand up in court against this man?" "It would mean a trip to Carson City for the trial," Ethan said. "And you'd probably have to face the men who took you again. I won't lie to you, it won't be easy." "She's been through more than enough," James argued. "There has to be another way." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "Mr. Harlow, I understand why you're worried. But without Victoria's testimony, Brennan will walk free just like he always does. He'll keep hurting families all over Nevada." Victoria took a deep breath. "I'll do it," she said, her own resolve surprising her. "If what I say can stop that man from hurting anyone else, then I have to." Her father looked at her, his face a mix of pride and fear. "Victoria, are you sure? These are bad people." "I'm sure," she said, lifting her chin. "I'm not going to let fear run my life." A hint of admiration showed in Ethan's eyes. "You've got a lot of courage, Miss Harlow. But your father is right about the danger. Until Brennan is behind bars, you'll need someone watching over you." "And that's why you're staying right here," James declared. "Mrs. Winters already has the guest room ready for you." Victoria looked from her father to the marshal, the reality sinking in that Ethan Daniels would be staying under her roof. The thought sent a funny little flutter through her that had nothing to do with being scared. "When do you think Brennan will make his next move?" she asked, pulling her thoughts back to the problem. "Hard to say," Ethan answered. "But he doesn't seem like the kind of man who takes losing well. When he finds out his men failed and we have two of them, he'll either try again or try to silence the witnesses." Victoria shivered. "Well, that's comforting." A small smile touched Ethan's lips. "My apologies, Miss Harlow. I just believe in being straight with folks about what they're up against." "So do I, Marshal," she shot back, looking him right in the eye. "I appreciate you being honest, even when the truth is ugly." For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a silent understanding. Victoria was the first to look away, feeling her father's watchful eyes on them. "Well," James said, getting to his feet. "Mrs. Winters should have supper on the table soon. Marshal, you make yourself at home. This house is your house for as long as you need it." "Much obliged, sir," Ethan said, standing too. "And please, if we're going to be living under the same roof, I'd appreciate it if you'd call me Ethan." "Ethan, it is," James agreed with a nod. "And I'm James. No need for all that formal business now." As they all walked toward the dining room, Victoria walked beside Ethan, noticing the easy way he moved for a lawman who'd seen his share of trouble. "How long have you been a U.S. Marshal?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. He told her it had been 5 years. Before that, he spent 3 years with the Texas Rangers, and before that he was a cavalryman in the war. Victoria did the math in her head. "You must have been just a boy during the war." A darkness flickered in his eyes. 17 when I signed up. Old enough to hold a rifle. Too young to know who I was fighting for." He paused. "Or against." She knew there was a deeper story there, but supper was ready. During the meal, she caught herself watching him. He was a puzzle, a hard-nosed lawman with good manners, a gunslinger who could talk about Shakespeare with Mrs. Winters. After supper, her father, James, went to check the store's books. Victoria stood to help clear the table, but Mrs. Winters waved her off. "You've had enough commotion for one day. Go on and rest in the parlor. I'm sure the marshal would appreciate the company." Victoria saw the twinkle in the old woman's eye and felt her cheeks grow warm. Mrs. Winters had practically raised her and wasn't shy about her belief that Victoria at 22 ought to be thinking about a husband. Seeing no polite way out, Victoria went to the parlor. Ethan stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the street outside. "Are you expecting trouble tonight?" she asked softly. He glanced down at her. "Not expecting, but always ready. It is how I have stayed alive this long." "That sounds mighty tiring," Victoria said. "Always being on guard." He gave a small shrug. "You get used to it." In the lamplight, she studied his face. He had a strong jaw and eyes that missed nothing. "Did you always want to be a lawman?" she asked. He was quiet for a spell. "I have always believed in justice," he said at last. "The law is not always the same thing as justice." "And when they are not?" Victoria pushed. His eyes met hers, surprisingly honest. "Then a man has to choose. Has to. I choose justice every single time." Now she understood why he had hunted Brennan with such fire. "Is that why you have spent so much time chasing this man? For justice?" "That is part of it," Ethan admitted. He seemed to weigh his next words. "Men like Brennan. They took my younger sister. She was 19. I was off at the war. By the time I got home and tracked her down..." He stopped, his jaw tight. "I was too late. She decided to take her own way out rather than keep living like that." A small gasp escaped Victoria's lips, and she instinctively placed a hand on his arm. "Oh, Ethan, I am so sorry." He looked at her hand, then back to her face. "It was a long time ago. But fellas like Brennan are still out there, and the law does not always stop them." "But you will," Victoria said. It was not a question. "Yes, he said plainly. I will. The air between them was thick with unspoken feelings. It was Ethan who finally broke the spell, turning back to the window. You should get some rest. We need to talk about keeping you and your father safe tomorrow. Victoria nodded, understanding he needed his space. Of course. Good night, Marshal. Good night, Victoria, he answered, his voice soft. As she went upstairs, she thought about the man in her parlor. He was dangerous but gentle, a haunted man with a powerful purpose, and she was drawn to him more than she had ever been to anyone. That night she slept soundly, feeling safe for the first time in a long while. The next week settled into a new kind of normal. Ethan was a quiet guest, often out working with the sheriff, but he was always there for meals, his watchful eye never far from the store when Victoria insisted on going back to work. I cannot hide forever, she had told him and her father. This is my life, and I will not let that man take it from me. They had finally agreed, but Ethan had rules. Victoria was never to be alone, and a loaded shotgun was always kept behind the counter. Victoria found herself watching Ethan in quiet moments. She noticed the smooth way he moved and the rare smiles that changed his whole face. On the 7th day, she was arranging ribbons when the bell on the door chimed. She looked up and her welcoming smile faded. It was Clayton Jeff, the banker's son, strutting in like he owned the place. Miss Harlow, he said, tipping his hat. Good to see you are all recovered. Her smile tightened. Clayton had been pestering her for months. Thank you, Mr. Jeff. Did you need something? He leaned on the counter, getting too close. Just seeing how you are. Father mentioned your store loan is due next week. If things are tight, I'm sure we could work something out. The meaning behind his words was ugly and clear. Our finances are just fine, Mr. Jeff, she said coolly. Besides, my father handles business with your father. Clayton's slimy smile never faltered. Of course. But your recent troubles prove that a woman on her own is in a tough spot. A husband with money could offer some real security. Before Victoria could give him the sharp reply he deserved, a shadow fell between them. Ethan was standing right behind Clayton, his face like stone. Miss Harlow is not alone, Mr. Jeff, Ethan said in a low voice, and I believe she already gave you her answer. Clayton turned, trying to hide his irritation. Marshal, I did not realize you were her personal bodyguard. The U.S. Marshal Service looks after its witnesses, Ethan said, his voice level. Now, unless you are buying something, I suggest you move along. Clayton's face turned red, but he saw the steel in Ethan's eyes and backed down. Another time, he muttered to Victoria before leaving. When he was gone, Victoria let out a long breath. Thank you. That man has been a thorn in my side for months. Ethan's hard expression softened just a bit. He seemed mighty persistent. Victoria sighed. Clayton thinks his father's bank gives him the right to anything he wants. Some men just will not take no for an answer, Ethan remarked, as he helped her fix a bolt of cloth Clayton had knocked aside. Victoria sighed. That has been my experience with most of them, especially when a woman is the one saying it. Ethan stopped what he was doing and looked straight at her. I hope you do not include me in that group. A warmth crept into Victoria's cheeks. No, she answered quietly. You are not like most men, Ethan. For a second, something like surprise or maybe even pleasure flashed in his eyes before James Harlow walked in holding a stack of mail. A letter from the circuit judge, he said, giving a serious-looking envelope to Ethan. Just came by express rider. Ethan read the letter, his brow furrowed. The trial is set for 3 weeks from today in Carson City. Judge Harmon wants to take Victoria's deposition first, just in case. He paused. Just in case Brennan manages to shut me up for good, Victoria said, finishing his sentence. She appreciated him trying to be gentle, but she preferred the hard truth. Ethan gave a grim nod. Exactly. The judge is sending his clerk to Humboldt tomorrow to take your sworn statement. Ethan said, he probably already figures it out. But you are right, this makes it official. We will have to be twice as careful starting tomorrow. Victoria squared her shoulders, refusing to let the fear in her belly show. I am not backing down. If my testimony helps lock that man away, then that is what I have to do. Ethan looked at her with a mix of respect and worry. You have a lot of grit, Victoria. But grit will not stop a bullet. From this moment on, you do not go anywhere unless I or your father is with you. The seriousness of his words filled the room. Victoria nodded, knowing the danger was real. But even so, a small part of her felt a little thrill at the thought of spending more time with Ethan. The next day, the judge's clerk showed up. He was a nervous young man named Edwin Powell who looked like he had never been far from Carson City. He laid out his ink, pen, and papers in the parlor while Victoria sat across from him with Ethan standing like a hawk by the window. Now, Miss Harlow, Powell started, fiddling with his glasses, I need you to tell me everything about your kidnapping. Take all the time you need. She started her story from the moment the three men walked into her father's store. She told him how they pretended to look for mining gear, then pulled their guns when no one else was around. And they said Brennan's name? Powell asked, his pen flying across the page. Yes, Victoria said. The tallest one, who the others called Salis, said, Brennan's paying a high price for this one. Says she'll fetch a fine sum with that face. Powell kept writing. And did they say anything about your father's business with Mr. Brennan? Victoria nodded. When I asked them why, that same man told me your daddy should have stayed out of Brennan's saloon business. Now he will find out what happens when you cross the wrong person. While she spoke, Victoria could feel Ethan's eyes on her. When their gazes met, she found the strength to get through the ugliest parts of her memory. When she got to the part about her rescue, Powell looked at Ethan with a new kind of respect. You took on 4 armed men all by yourself, Marshal Daniels? Ethan looked a little uncomfortable. I just caught them by surprise and only 3 of them were armed. That is still mighty brave, Powell said, obviously impressed. Victoria gave a small smile. Marshal Daniels is just being modest. He saved my life, and he nearly lost his own doing it. Ethan cleared his throat. What matters here is Miss Harlow's testimony, not what I did. Powell agreed and went back to his questions. By the time they were done, the sun was setting, and Victoria felt worn out from reliving it all. Thank you, Miss Harlow, Powell said as he packed up. Your story is strong and clear. I have no doubt the judge will believe you, and it ought to be enough to get warrants for Clayton Brennan. After Sheriff Thompson took Powell to the hotel, Victoria just sat in the parlor. Ethan brought her a cup of tea and sat down. You did real good today, he told her. It is not easy to talk about such things. Victoria took a grateful sip. I just told the truth. It was not pleasant, but it will be worth it if it puts Brennan away. It will, Ethan promised. Your testimony was solid. Juries like that. They sat quietly for a bit before Victoria asked what was on her mind. What will happen after the trial is over? Will you be moving on? Ethan stared into the fireplace. That all depends on how it turns out. If Brennan is found guilty, then yes, I will likely be sent where I am needed next. Victoria felt a wave of disappointment. I guess the life of a U.S. Marshal does not give you much chance to put down roots. Not so far, he said, turning to look at her. But I have never really had a reason to think about it before. The meaning behind his words hung in the air between them, and Victoria's heart beat a little faster. The moment was broken when Mrs. Winters came in to announce dinner was ready. As they got up, Ethan put a hand on her elbow for just a second, a simple touch that sent a warmth all through her. In the following days, the whole town of Humboldt grew tense. Everyone knew Victoria had given her official statement. Sheriff Thompson put more deputies on patrol. On the 4th night, Victoria was woken up past midnight by shouting downstairs. She quickly put on a robe and went to see what was wrong. She crept to the landing to hear what was being said. Sheriff Thompson's voice was stretched tight. He said they rode into town an hour ago. My deputy saw them down on the south end. 5 men, and they were all carrying heavy iron. Ethan's voice cut in, sharp and awake. That sounds like Brennan's men. They likely checked into the hotel with fake names, but Jackson knew 2 of them from wanted posters. Victoria felt her hand squeeze the banister. 5 men sent here just for her. The danger suddenly felt as real as the wood beneath her fingers. We have to move Victoria and her father somewhere safe, Ethan said. They are too out in the open here. Where to? Thompson asked. My jail is not strong enough for that many determined men, and there is no help for 100 miles. There was a long silence. Then Ethan spoke low. I have a cabin up in the hills, about 15 miles west. It is hidden, easy to defend, and not many people know it exists. How soon can you be ready to go? Thompson asked. At first light, Ethan answered. We have to move in the dark tomorrow night, just in case they are watching the roads. The sheriff promised to get supplies ready and to spread a false story about them taking the eastbound stagecoach. Victoria had heard all she needed to. She walked down the stairs, making her presence known. Both men spun around, their hands reaching for their guns before they saw who it was. Victoria, Ethan said, his face softening just a little. You should be in bed. It is hard to sleep when folks are deciding my future without me, she said, pulling her robe tighter as she joined them. If we are leaving for some cabin, I ought to be packing my things, not sleeping. Sheriff Thompson looked a little embarrassed, but Ethan looked her right in the eye. You are right. We should have told you. But this danger is real, Victoria. Brennan's men are in town, and they are not here to sightsee. I know the danger, she said, her voice steady. I am not fighting the plan. I just want to be part of it, not some piece of luggage you move around. Ethan watched her for a moment and then gave a nod. Fair enough. We head out at dawn. Pack only what you need. The cabin is small, but it is safe and has food. I will wake your father soon, Ethan promised. Sheriff Thompson will stay here in Humboldt to keep an eye on Brennan's men. Victoria looked at the sheriff. You be careful. These men do not sound like they play fair. Thompson's weathered face broke into a smile. Do not you worry about me, Miss Harlow. I have been handling trouble in this territory since before you were a little girl. After the sheriff was gone, Victoria and Ethan stood there in the quiet parlor. She suddenly felt uneasy in her nightgown and robe. This cabin of yours, she started, trying to fill the silence, is it a place you visit often? Ethan shook his head. Not often. It is for emergencies, a place to lay low when things get rough. And very few people know about it, he confirmed. That is why you and your father will be safe there. Victoria nodded. Then she asked the question that had been on her mind. What happens after we get to this cabin? Do we just hide there until the trial? Ethan's face grew serious. That is the hope. But if Brennan's men are here, they will not give up so easy. They will look for you. They might find the place. They might find... When that happens, we have to be ready. Ready to fight? She asked, a chill running down her spine. I hope not, Ethan said quietly, but yes, we must be prepared for that. She stood up a little straighter. Then you ought to know that I can shoot. My father taught me when I was 16. I am not the best with a pistol, but I can handle a rifle just fine. A flash of surprise showed on Ethan's face, followed by a look of respect. That is good to know. Most women I meet have not had that kind of learning. My father always said a woman on the frontier should know how to defend herself, she explained, especially after my mother passed on. Ethan's gaze seemed to soften. Your father is a smart man. He looked toward the stairs. I should go wake him. We have a lot to do before the sun comes up. As she turned to head upstairs, Ethan called her name. Victoria. She stopped and looked back. I promise you, I will not let anything happen to you or your father, no matter what it takes. The power in his voice sent a shiver through her that was not from fear. I believe you, Ethan. Good night. As she went up the stairs, she wondered what the next few days would hold. Being hidden away in a cabin with Ethan Daniels meant they would be in close quarters, a thought that was both exciting and terrifying. Dawn was cold and gray over Humboldt as the three of them loaded a plain wagon, working quiet and fast. Mrs. Winters gave Victoria a tight hug before they left, pushing a warm loaf of bread into her hands. You be safe, child, the old woman whispered, and you watch over that marshal of yours. He looks at you like a thirsty man looks at water. Victoria's cheeks turned bright red. He is not my marshal, Mrs. Winters. The housekeeper just patted her cheek and smiled. If you say so, dear. Just remember what I told you about men. Victoria got into the wagon next to her father as Ethan took the reins. They started out heading east, the wrong direction, in case anyone was watching. The sheriff had a deputy waiting for them at a crossroads 5 miles out of town. There, they would switch to horses and ride for the hills. The trip was tense. Ethan never stopped scanning the horizon for trouble. At the meeting spot, Deputy Collins had 3 horses ready. "Any problems?" Ethan asked as they moved their supplies. Collins shook his head. "The road has been quiet all morning. But the sheriff said 2 of Brennan's men were at the stage office asking about folks heading east." "Good," Ethan said. "That means our little trick is working. That little show ought to keep them busy. Head on back to town, and remember, if anyone asks, you were on the eastern road and saw nothing." The deputy gave a quick nod, swung up on his horse, and galloped back toward Humboldt. Ethan then helped Victoria onto her saddle. They pushed west into the hills, following trails that only animals seemed to use. By noon, they were high enough to see Humboldt sitting small in the valley far below. The air up there was crisp, and pine trees replaced the dusty brush. James Harlow, who had been quiet all morning, finally spoke up. "How much further to this hideout of yours, Marshal?" "About 3 more hours," Ethan said, steering his horse around a big rock. "We will make it before the sun goes down." Victoria watched her daddy with a worried heart. At 53, James was still a strong man, but this whole mess was wearing on him. You could see it in the new lines etched around his eyes. "We can stop for a bit if you need to, Father," she said softly. James sat up straighter, like he was caught showing a weakness. "I am fine, Victoria. Just worrying about the store. I hope Thompson remembers to check that leaky roof if a storm rolls in. That back corner has been a problem since last winter." Victoria and Ethan shared a look. They both knew James was just trying to hang on to something normal when everything was sideways. "He will, Father. Mrs. Winters will not let him forget it." They rode on in a comfortable quiet, stopping now and then to let the horses breathe and to eat some bread and dried beef. The country got prettier the higher they climbed, with views that stretched out forever. Late in the afternoon, they rode down into a little valley tucked between 2 ridges. A clear stream cut through it, and there, mostly hidden by pine trees, was a solid log cabin. "There it is," Ethan said, pointing. "Home, for a little while anyway." Victoria took in the sight of the cabin as they got closer. It was bigger than she had pictured, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. The spot was perfect for hiding. You would never find it unless you knew exactly where to look. "It is lovely," she said, truly surprised. "You had this place long?" "About 5 years," Ethan answered, swinging down from his horse to help her. "Bought it from an old trapper. I have fixed it up some when I could." His hands were firm at her waist as he lifted her down. For just a second, they stood so close she could feel his warmth and see the little gold flecks in his green eyes. Then he stepped away to help her father. The cabin's inside was simple but cozy. There was one big main room with a stone fireplace, a heavy wood table, and a few sturdy pieces of furniture. A curtain at the back hid a sleeping area. "It is not much," Ethan said, watching her look around. "But it is safe. The walls are thick and there is only 1 door and 2 windows, both with strong shutters." James nodded, looking pleased. "You picked a good spot, Marshal. Easy to defend, with fresh water right here." "There is a small bedroom behind that curtain," Ethan went on. "Victoria can have that. Mr. Harlow, you can take the loft up the stairs. I will sleep down here." Victoria felt a little guilty. "I can take the loft if Father wants the room." James shook his head. "Do not be silly, Victoria. A lady needs her privacy. The loft will do me just fine." As they put their things away, Victoria found herself watching Ethan. He was different in this place, more relaxed. The heavy weight of his marshal's badge seemed to lift a little. He built a fire like he had done it 1,000 times, then checked the door and windows before starting to fix them a simple meal. "You seem right at home here," Victoria said, walking over to where he was slicing meat and potatoes. "I suppose I am," he said, his hands never stopping. "This is the only place that has felt like a real home to me since before the war." "Yet you are hardly ever here." Ethan glanced at her. "This kind of life does not let a man stay put for long." And a cabin like this is not much good to a man all by himself. There was a loneliness in his voice that tugged at Victoria's heart. She wanted to ask him more, but her father came over and the chance was gone. After a good stew, they sat by the fire while the valley grew dark. James was worn out and soon went up to the loft, leaving Victoria and Ethan alone. "How long do you think we will need to stay here?" Victoria asked. Ethan poked the fire with a stick. "Hard to say for sure. The trial is in a little over 2 weeks. Best if we can lay low right here until then." She nodded, watching the firelight dance on his face. "And if Brenna's men find us before then?" "They will not have an easy time of it," Ethan promised her. "There is only one real way to get to this cabin, and I've got some things set up to warn us if anyone is coming." He paused for a moment. "They will find out I am not a man who is easily surprised." Victoria believed him. She had seen how he was always watching, always aware of everything around him. It was what had kept him alive. "Have you ever thought about what you will do when this is all over?" she asked quietly. "After Brenna is dealt with?" Ethan stared into the flames for a long time. "You know," he said, his voice low, "I have been chasing bad men for so long, I am not sure I know how to do anything else." But lately he looked right at her. "Lately I have started to wonder if there is more to life than that." Victoria felt her breath catch in her throat. "What kind of more?" But before he could say another word, a sound from outside made them both go still. It was the snap of a twig, sharp and clear over the crackle of the fire. Ethan was on his feet in an instant, his hand on his gun. "Stay put," he whispered. He moved to the window without a sound and looked through a tiny crack in the shutters. Victoria's heart was hammering in her chest. Had they been found already? It just did not seem possible. After a long, tense minute, Ethan's shoulders relaxed just a little. "A deer," he said, turning back to her with a small smile. "Just a buck, curious about his new neighbors." Victoria let out a breath she did not realize she was holding. "You are sure?" "I can see him plain as day in the moonlight," Ethan said. "But it is a good reminder. We have to stay sharp even here." The spell between them was broken. The cold truth of their danger had rushed back in. Victoria stood up, suddenly feeling how late it was. "I should probably get some rest. It has been a very long day." Ethan nodded, though his eyes told her he did not want the conversation to end. "Of course. Sleep well, Victoria. I will keep watch for a while." "Good night, Ethan," she said softly. "And thank you for everything you are doing to protect us." His smile in the firelight was warm. "No thanks are needed. Just get some rest." Later, in the small but cozy bedroom, Victoria thought about how her life had turned upside down. A week ago, she was a shopkeeper's daughter in a quiet Nevada town. Now she was a witness in hiding, with a handsome U.S. Marshal watching over her. She fell asleep listening to the comforting sound of Ethan moving around the cabin, making sure they were safe from the dangers of the night. The days at the cabin settled into a peaceful rhythm. Mornings began early. They ate simple meals, including fresh trout from the stream and wild berries Victoria found nearby. Her father, James Harlow, seemed to relax after a day or so. He spent his time reading the few books on the cabin's shelf or sitting in the sun, sketching the landscape. On the third day, as Victoria was outside, she thought about the strange path her life had taken. Ethan found her washing the lunch dishes. "I need to see how well you can handle a rifle," he said straight out. "If Brennan's men come for us, I have to know what you can do." Victoria dried her hands and looked him right in the eye. "Right now?" He nodded. "Your father is resting. We can set up some targets out in the meadow." They walked out about 100 yards from the cabin. Ethan had his Winchester and a smaller Remington, which he gave to Victoria. "This one has less kick," he told her. "It is easier to be accurate with it." Victoria took the rifle like she was born holding it, checking it over just as her father had taught her. Ethan watched her, looking pleased. "You have handled a gun before," he said. "I told you my father taught me," she said with a little smile. "Did you think I was making that up?" "Not at all," he said. "But there is a big difference between being shown how to shoot and really knowing a weapon." Victoria just raised an eyebrow. "Well, you set up your targets, Marshal Daniels. I will be happy to show you what I know. A grin touched the corner of Ethan's mouth as he set out some cans on a log. Then he stood back and motioned for her to begin. Victoria stepped right up, settled the rifle against her shoulder, and drew a bead on the closest can. The crack of the Remington echoed and the can jumped clean off the log. She didn't miss a beat, swinging the barrel to the next target and the next, knocking down 5 out of the 7. When she lowered the rifle, she saw Ethan looking at her, mighty impressed. "Well now," he said with a grin, "your daddy sure taught you right." Victoria couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. "He always said I had a good eye for it." Ethan pointed with his chin. "You missed the far ones, though. That ain't about talent, just practice." He stepped in behind her as she raised the rifle again, his hands gently adjusting her elbows and shoulders. She felt the solid warmth of his chest near her back, his breath stirring her hair. "Like this," he said low. "Drop that left elbow a bit. It'll steady your aim for the long shots." She tried to listen, but his closeness sent a flutter through her. She lined up a shot, did what he said, and squeezed the trigger. The bottle shattered just right. "Perfect," Ethan said, his hands staying on her shoulders a second too long. They practiced for another hour, and with Ethan's help, Victoria's aim got even better. By the time they headed back, she felt ready for whatever might come. James was on the porch, a sketchbook in his lap. He looked up and smiled when he saw the rifle. "Heard some shooting. How'd she do?" "Mr. Harlow, your daughter is a real deadeye," Ethan said with a respect that made Victoria stand a little taller. "With a little more time, she could outshoot most fellas I know." James just nodded, not surprised at all. "Victoria's always been a quick study, don't matter if it's numbers, haggling, or shooting. Her mother was just like that, could do anything she set her mind to." Victoria felt a warmth spread through her chest at that. "I had good teachers," she said, looking from her father to Ethan. Later that night, they gathered round the fire. Ethan spread a map on the table. "The straightest way takes us through Devil's Canyon," he said, tracing a narrow path. "But that's a perfect spot for an ambush. I reckon we take this longer way, along the old mining trail. It'll add half a day," Ethan continued, "but we'll be able to see anyone coming." James leaned in close. "What about Fenton's Bridge? That'd save some time." Ethan shook his head. "Bridge washed out in the spring floods." As they talked over the details, Victoria found herself watching Ethan's hands on the map. They were strong hands, the same ones that had saved her life and steadied her aim. She had a little secret, though. 2 days ago, she'd peeked in a journal he'd left out. It wasn't just maps and notes, it was filled with beautiful drawings of mountains and rivers, and even a few faces, all captured by a man who seemed as hard as nails on the outside. She hadn't said a word about it, figuring it was his private business. But knowing he was a lawman, a protector, and a secret artist changed things. Her father's voice pulled her back to the map. "Victoria, what do you think about all this?" She blinked, realizing she'd drifted off. "I am sorry. What was that?" James just smiled. "Ethan reckons we ought to lay low in Carson City for a spell after the trial, just in case Brennan's got friends looking for payback. I said we should head straight back to Humboldt and open the store." Victoria weighed her options. Their store was their whole life, but her daddy's safety came first. "I've got an idea," she said. "We go back, but we hire some guards for a while." "That's smart," Ethan agreed. "I can talk to the governor about sending a deputy marshal your way." "You're not coming back with us?" she asked, her voice betraying her disappointment. "That all depends on where they send me next," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "But I can sure make the recommendation." The thought of him leaving had been a shadow in her mind, but hearing it out loud made it real and sharp. "Well," James said, folding up his map, "we will cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, this old man is turning in." As he went upstairs, Victoria stayed put, tracing the map with her finger. Ethan watched her for a spell before speaking. "You have shown a lot of grit through all this," he said quietly. "Most folks would have folded by now." "I do not feel gritty," she admitted. "Most of the time I'm scared spitless." I just try to hide it. That is what courage is, Ethan replied. Not being without fear, but saddling up anyway. She managed a small smile. Is that what you do? Act despite the fear? Every single day, he said, his honesty a surprise. In my line of work, fear is what keeps you sharp. What are you afraid of, Ethan Daniels? She asked softly, truly wanting to know. He was quiet for a long moment. I'm afraid of failing the people who count on me, he finally said, his voice low. And lately, I have been afraid of what comes after this is all done. His gaze was steady. For years, my life has been simple. Find the outlaw, bring him to justice, and move on. It has been a lonely road, but a clear one. He paused. But meeting you and your father, well, it has made me wonder if that is enough anymore. The air between them felt alive with a new kind of quiet. Her heart pounded in her chest. And what have you concluded? Before he could say a word, a sharp whistle cut through the night. A bird call that had no business being out so late. Ethan was on his feet in a heartbeat, his hand on his pistol. That is one of my signals, he whispered. Killing the lamp. Somebody is on the trail. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. Brennan's men. Or just someone lost, Ethan said, but his face told her he did not believe it. Stay put. Keep your rifle handy, but do not fire unless I say so. He moved to the window, a shadow in the dim firelight. Wake your father. I'm going to circle around and see who our company is. Ethan? Victoria whispered as he reached the door. Be careful. He glanced back, a faint smile on his lips. Always. Then he slipped into the night. She hurried to wake her father, who was awake and armed in an instant. James took his post at the loft window while Victoria returned to the main room, her rifle ready. The minutes crawled by in the near darkness. When the door finally creaked open, she nearly shot before she saw it was Ethan. 3 riders, he reported, his voice barely a whisper. They made camp a half-mile down the valley. They are not woodsmen, but I got close enough to hear them talking. Brennan's men, she said, already knowing. Ethan gave a grim nod. They mentioned your name and the reward. They are not sure we are up here, but they are looking. James came down from the loft, his face etched with worry. How did they find this place? They are working a grid, Ethan explained, searching every possible hideout. They got lucky finding the valley, but they do not know about this cabin just yet. What is the plan? Victoria asked, her voice steady. Ethan thought for a second. We can try to slip out before dawn, or we can stay here and hope they pass us by. If we run, we might get caught in the open, James pointed out. And if we stay and they find us, we will be cornered, Ethan finished. But we would have the high ground. Victoria looked between the 2 men. I am done running, she said, her voice hard as steel. They made me feel like prey once. It is not happening again. If they find us, we will be ready. A look of pride flickered in Ethan's eyes. Then we get ready for a fight. They spent the next few hours in tense preparation, moving furniture for cover and placing extra ammunition within reach. As the sky began to lighten, Ethan gathered them. I will be on the rocks above. I will see them before they see us. Mr. Harlow, you take the loft again. Victoria, stay low and cover the door. He paused for a moment. If things go south, do not take foolish chances. And if something happens to me, there is a trap door under the rug by the fireplace. It leads to a tunnel. Get your father and go. As he made to leave, he stopped beside her. About what I was saying last night, it can wait, Victoria said softly. Until after. Ethan nodded, his hand briefly brushing hers. Until after, he agreed. Then he was gone into the gray morning light. The waiting was the worst part. Victoria sat with the Remington rifle across her lap, her eyes fixed on the door. Above, she heard the floorboards creak as her father kept watch. The sun was up when a bird call broke the silence, 3 short whistles and 1 long one. It was Ethan's signal. They were coming. She tightened her grip on the rifle and nodded up toward the loft. They waited, listening with every fiber of their being. Then they heard voices, rough and getting closer. We are wasting our time up here, She's probably halfway to California. Brennan said to check every cabin in these hills. You want to tell him we got tired? The voices were right outside now. Victoria held her breath. A heavy knock shook the door. Hello, the house. Anybody home? Victoria froze, her finger resting on the rifle. The men outside knocked again, harder this time. Looks like nobody's home, one of them said. But that woodpile out back is fresh. Somebody's been here. Try the door, a second voice ordered. The latch rattled, but it held. It's locked from the inside, the man called out. You want me to bust it down? There was a short pause. No. Circle around and check the windows first. No need to stir up a hornet's nest if we don't have to. Victoria heard their boots crunching on the dirt as they walked around the cabin. She pulled herself deeper into the shadows, praying they wouldn't see her or her father hiding up in the loft. Can't see much, one of the men said after they made their way around. But someone's living here. There's fresh ash in the fireplace. Then break it down, the order came. Victoria braced herself, lifting the rifle. The first crash shook the heavy door. It was strong, Ethan had made sure of that. But it wouldn't last forever. The men outside seemed to figure that out, too. This ain't no regular cabin door, one said. Somebody's hiding something, another voice growled. Or someone. Victoria's mind was spinning like a dust devil. Where on earth was Ethan? What was he waiting for? She peeked up at the loft, catching her father's worried eyes. He nudged his pistol, silently asking if it was time to start shooting. Victoria gave a tiny shake of her head. Ethan had a plan, and they had to trust it. The sudden sound of a horse galloping up the trail broke the quiet. "Riders coming," one of the goons yelled out. Victoria's heart jumped. She heard the cold clicks of hammers being pulled back, then a calm voice she knew well. "Morning, gentlemen. A mighty fine day for a ride in these hills, isn't it?" It was Sheriff Thompson. A tense quiet fell over the place. "Who in the hell are you?" one man demanded. "Sheriff Morgan Thompson, Humboldt County," came the steady answer. "And you fellas are a long way from home. You mind telling me what brings you to this part of the country?" Victoria couldn't believe it. The sheriff was here. How did he find them? "We're just looking for a friend," another man said, sounding wary. "Heard he and his girl might be holed up here." "This friend got a name?" Thompson asked. "James Harlow and his daughter." The sheriff let out a genuine laugh. "Well then, you boys are on a wild goose chase. The Harlows took the stagecoach east 3 days ago, heading to Denver to see family." The silence that followed was thick with suspicion. "You sound awful sure about that, Sheriff," a man finally spoke up, "and you seem awful interested in our business." "It's my job to know who comes and goes in my county," Thompson said, his voice level. "Just like it's my job to see why strangers are creeping around an old cabin with their guns out." Victoria heard the scuff of boots in the dirt as the men shifted their weight. This whole thing was balanced on a razor's edge. "Now," Thompson went on, his voice getting a little harder, "I suggest y'all get to moving. This cabin belongs to a friend of mine, and he don't take kindly to trespassers." "And what if we ain't ready to leave just yet?" one of the men shot back. What happened next was a blur. A single gunshot echoed from the rocks high above the cabin, kicking up dirt right at the men's feet. It had to be Ethan. At the same time, Sheriff Thompson's voice boomed. "That would be a big mistake, gentlemen. You are surrounded." Victoria risked a look through a crack in the wall. The sheriff sat on his horse, his shotgun aimed steady at the three thugs. They were just cowboys, but they were heavily armed and now looked as nervous as long-tailed cats in a room full of rocking chairs. "U.S. Marshal Daniels has a rifle on you from those rocks," Thompson said calmly. "And I can promise you he does not miss. I also have 2 deputies in the trees over to your left. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time to put down your weapons and tell me your real business here." The air was tight for a few long seconds. Then, one by one, the men put their pistols away. "Brennan sent us," the leader admitted. "Said the Harlow girl was fixing to cause him trouble in court." "And what were you supposed to do when you found her?" the sheriff pushed. The man looked down at his boots. "Just convince her that talking wasn't in her best interest." "With those?" Thompson asked. nodding at their guns. Their silence was all the answer he needed. "All right, here is what is going to happen," the sheriff declared. "You are going to get on your horses and ride back to whatever hole Brennan is hiding in. You will tell him Victoria Harlow is under the protection of the U.S. Marshal Service and the Territorial Court. Any more attempts to scare or hurt her will bring more charges down on him and anyone who helps him. Is that clear?" The men looked at each other, sizing up their options. Finally, the leader gave a short nod. "Clear enough, but Brennan ain't gonna like it." "Brennan's happiness is not my concern," Thompson said flatly. "Now, get on your horses. My deputies will see you to the county line." Victoria watched as the men walked slowly to their horses. Just as they were about to leave, Ethan stepped out from the rocks, his rifle still aimed. "One more thing," he called down. "You tell Brennan that Marshal Daniels sends his regards. And you tell him the next time he sends men after Victoria, there won't be any warnings." The threat in his voice was as sharp as a razor. The men scrambled onto their horses and took off down the trail, with 2 other riders appearing from the trees to follow them. It was only when the sound of hoofbeats was gone that Victoria finally unlocked the cabin door. She stepped outside where Ethan and Sheriff Thompson were talking quietly. They both turned when they saw her, their faces full of relief. "Victoria," Ethan said, walking over to her. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she answered, her voice a little shaky. "How did the sheriff know we were here?" Thompson swung down from his horse and took off his hat just as James Harlow stepped out of the cabin. "It was not too hard to figure out. When Brennan's boys started poking around the hills, I figured you could use a hand, Marshal," Sheriff Thompson said. Ethan gave a thankful nod. "Your timing was a godsend, Sheriff. Your deputies, too." A grin cracked Thompson's leathery face. "Weren't no deputies. Just my own voice and your good aim. But they bought it." James looked worried. "You reckon they will clear out for good?" "They will," Ethan stated plainly. "That kind is yellow-bellied. They wanted easy pickings, not a real fight." Victoria let out a long sigh of relief. "So it is really over." Ethan's gaze softened on her. "This part is. But Brennan will not quit. We still have to get you to Carson City." Thompson jumped in with good news. "The circuit judge is already in Humboldt. He has seen your statement, Victoria, and put out warrants for Brennan and his whole crew." Hope surged through her. "Then maybe I will not have to testify?" "Oh, he will still get his day in court," Ethan clarified. "But with warrants out, your words will just be sealing the deal, not starting the whole thing." James put a hand on his daughter's arm. "That is mighty good news, Sheriff. We are much obliged to you for riding all this way." Thompson just waved it off. "Just doing my job, James. Known you all too long to let some saloon trash run you off." He looked to Ethan. "What is next for you, Marshal?" "Still Carson City," Ethan replied. "But we will take our time now. Wait a day or two and take the long way around, just in case." As they talked plans, Victoria watched Ethan, her mind drifting back to the conversation they never got to finish. He had been on the verge of telling her something important. After the sheriff shared a meal and rode off, a quiet settled over the cabin. Later that evening, she found herself sitting with Ethan on the porch as her father rested inside. They sat on the bench, watching the sun bleed all orange and purple across the sky. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly, "for everything." Ethan looked over at her. "No need to thank me. It is my job." She found her courage. "Was it just your job, Ethan?" He stared at the horizon for a good while before he answered. "No, it has not been just a job for some time now." Her heart beat a little faster. "Last night, you said you were wondering if being a marshal was enough. What did you mean?" He turned to her, the sunset caught in his eyes. "I meant you made me think about things I had long given up on. A home, a family, something more than just chasing the next outlaw." Her breath caught in her throat. "And?" His hand covered hers on the bench, strong and warm. "And I reckon it is time to put down some roots. If I could find the right person to build that life with. The governor has offered me the chief marshal job for the territory. It is in Carson City. Less riding, more paperwork. I always said no before, but now you are thinking about it, she finished, her heart feeling full. More than thinking. I wrote him back 3 days ago and took the job, he admitted, looking straight at her. Victoria, I know this is coming on fast, but I would like your permission to call on you proper when this is all over. A smile finally broke free on her face. Is that what this is? A courtship? A small grin touched his lips. It is, if you will have me. I am asking if you would let me try to win your heart. She looked at their hands, then back at the man who had protected her and stolen her heart all at once. Ethan Daniels, she said, her voice soft. I think you know you already have. And yes, you may certainly call on me. But I should warn you, Mrs. Winters will watch us like a hawk. A real smile spread across Ethan's face, making him look younger. He leaned in and gave her a quick, gentle kiss that sent a shock of warmth right through her. I can handle Mrs. Winters, he said softly. My father will have a thing or two to say, she added. As he should, Ethan said, his face serious again. And I will answer him straight. I would not do this without his blessing. Right on cue, the cabin door creaked open and James Harlow stepped out. Victoria tried to pull her hand away, but Ethan held on tight, standing up to face him. Mr. Harlow, he said respectfully, I have just asked for your daughter's permission to court her. James looked from Ethan to Victoria, his face a perfect blank. Then a slow grin appeared. Took you long enough to speak your mind, Marshal. I have seen the way you all look at each other. Victoria's face burned hot. Father, James just chuckled. Neither of you is what I would call subtle. Ethan cleared his throat. So you are not against it, sir? James got serious then. Victoria makes her own choices. But I have to ask your intentions, and if you can provide for her. Of course, sir, Ethan answered. I have taken the chief marshal position in Carson City. It pays well and comes with a house. My intentions, sir, are marriage, if she will have me when the time is right. James nodded slowly. And the danger? It is a hard life, being married to the law. It is mostly a desk job, Ethan explained. My days of riding the range after outlaws are done. Listening to them, Victoria felt a mix of pride and happiness. Finally, she spoke up. Father, I appreciate you looking out for me, but I can make this choice for myself. James just laughed and held up his hands. Of course you are. I just had to hear the man say it. He offered his hand to Ethan. You have my blessing, Marshal Daniels. But I expect you to court my daughter properly. She deserves that much. Ethan shook his hand with a firm grip. You have my word, sir. As the three of them stood on the porch, a deep sense of peace washed over Victoria. The danger was not over yet, not with Brennan still out there. But for the first time, she could imagine a happy future beyond the trial. Ethan's hand found hers and gave it a gentle squeeze, and she squeezed back. Her heart was full as she looked out at the valley that had given them a safe place to hide, and somehow, a place to find love. 2 weeks later, Victoria stood tall on the courthouse steps in Carson City. She watched as they led Clayton Brennan away in chains, his face twisted in a mask of helpless rage. The trial was quick. Her calm, clear testimony about the kidnapping, along with the words from his own hired men, sealed his fate for good. Ethan stood right there beside her, not as a protector anymore, but as her intended, his hand resting easy at the small of her back. Her father, James Harlow, watched them with a look of pure pride. Victoria whispered, "It is finally over," like she could hardly believe the words herself. That man cannot hurt another soul. Ethan gave a firm nod. He got 20 years in the territorial prison. With the federal charges on top of that, he will likely never be a free man again. The weeks after the cabin had been a real blur. By the time they reached Carson City, the law had already torn down most of Brennan's crooked operation, with his own men turning on him to save their hides. Victoria's words were just the last shovel of dirt on his grave. Ethan stepped into his new job as chief marshal, and he, Victoria, and her father settled in. He called on her every day, always proper, with her father or one of the good ladies of the town making sure everything was on the up and up. Victoria soon realized the kind and smart man she saw at the cabin was the real Ethan. The hard shell he wore was just part of his dangerous job. As chief marshal, folks still respected his authority, but he seemed more comfortable in his own skin. And Ethan, well, he saw more than just a pretty face in Victoria. He saw she had grit and a sharp mind that never ceased to amaze him. They could talk about anything for hours. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Victoria asked, "So what comes next? Do you still have to speak against his men?" Ethan nodded. "For a few of them, yes. But that will be spread out over the next few months. It should not get in the way of our plans." She raised an eyebrow. "Our plans? And what might those be, Chief Marshal?" A little smile played on Ethan's lips. "Well, Miss Harlow, I was thinking it is about time I had a talk with your father about visiting the preacher. Unless you think 2 months is moving too fast." Victoria's heart just about jumped out of her chest. This was the closest he had come to a real proposal. "Some might say 2 months is a bit quick," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But we have been through a kidnapping and gunfire together. I figure we have lived about 10 years' worth in those 2 months," she finished. Ethan's smile grew wider. "My thoughts exactly. So, you would not be against a fall wedding, say October when the hills are all golden." "October sounds perfect," Victoria beamed. "But hold on, aren't you supposed to ask me on a bent knee with a ring?" He chuckled. "I had something a little more special in mind than the courthouse steps. Maybe a sunset ride up to a certain cabin where I first knew I was falling in love with you." The word love made her breath catch in her throat. "That sounds much better," she said softly. Just then her father walked over. "Well, that is that," James said with a satisfied sigh. "Justice is served. Now we can talk about heading back to Humboldt." Victoria and Ethan shared a look. "Actually, Father," she started, "there is something we wanted to talk to you about at dinner." James looked from one to the other, a knowing look on his face. "Let me guess. Y'all are planning on getting married. And you want my blessing for Victoria to stay here in Carson City." Victoria was stunned. "How did you know?" Her father smiled gently. "Honey, I might be getting old, but I am not blind. I have seen how happy you are here with Ethan." He sighed, the sound full of love and a little sadness. "The store was always meant for you, but I cannot ask you to set aside your own life for it." Ethan spoke up firmly. "We would never ask you to run it alone, sir. In fact, there is a position opening up in the Commerce office here that would be perfect for you. Good pay, good hours, and you would be working with the governor himself." James's eyebrows shot up. "You have been thinking about my future too?" Ethan nodded. "Your happiness matters to Victoria, which makes it matter a great deal to me. And truth be told, I would rather have the man whose daughter I aim to marry close by, not 100 miles away." James was clearly moved. Victoria added, "And we could sell the store or hire a manager. The important thing is we figure it out as a family," she said. That word, family, seemed to settle deep with James. He looked at his daughter and the man beside her and saw the start of something new and wonderful. "All right," he said, his voice a little thick. "I suppose I can hear a little more about this job." Victoria threw her arms around him. "Oh, thank you, Father." James patted her back. "You deserve all the happiness in the world, honey. And it is plain to see this man gives it to you." He then got a twinkle in his eye. "Now, I believe y'all had plans for a trip up to that cabin. Maybe this weekend with Mrs. Winters along to keep things proper?" Ethan nodded seriously, but Victoria saw the smile he was hiding. "Of course, sir. I would not have it any other way." 3 days later, she was riding toward that same cabin, but everything was different. This time she was beside Ethan, with Mrs. Winters following behind at a respectable distance. The autumn air was crisp and clean. The whole valley was peaceful and prettier than she remembered, with the trees just starting to turn to gold. "It has not changed one bit," she said as the cabin appeared. "Some things do not have to change to mean more," Ethan replied, looking at her instead of the view. They had kept things respectable during their courtship, but the memories of their first time at the cabin, talking by the fire, had been more than enough. Mrs. Winters, being her usual self, checked the cabin from top to bottom before giving them a moment alone on the porch. "I promised your father I would keep an eye on you too," she said, but her eyes were smiling. By sunset, they were sitting on the porch while Mrs. Winters made dinner inside. It was private enough for a real talk. "Do you remember our first conversation out here?" Victoria asked, watching the sun paint the sky. Ethan nodded, a thoughtful look on his face. "I told you I was thinking about this chief marshal job, about finally putting down some roots. And now look at us," Victoria said, her voice soft. "Planning our own roots together." Ethan took her hand. "There is something I need to ask you, Victoria. Properly this time." Her heart started to beat faster as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He got down on one knee right there on the porch, his eyes full of love. "Victoria Harlow," he began, his voice strong and sure. "The moment I cut you free and looked in your eyes, something shifted inside me. I know now that it was the start of me loving you." He opened the box to show a beautiful gold ring with a diamond and 2 small emeralds. "I am asking you to be my wife, my partner in all things. Will you marry me?" Her eyes filled with happy tears as she looked at this good, strong man who had saved her in more ways than one. "Yes, Ethan Daniels," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger and rose to kiss her. And in that moment, Victoria knew she was truly home. They were certain that the terrible ordeal they had shared had led them to a beautiful love, one forged in trouble but meant to last in quiet times. A soft cough from the doorway by Mrs. Winters announced that supper was ready. As they went inside, the setting sun was replaced by the warm glow of a lamp. Victoria felt a deep sense that she had come home, not to a place, but to a person. The autumn days passed in a blur of wedding plans. Her father, James Harlow, took a government post in Carson City, and Victoria put her touch on Ethan's house, making the bachelor's quarters a real family home. Ethan watched it all with a warm smile, just happy to see Victoria making the house their home. On a perfect October afternoon with the mountainsides blazing in fall colors, Victoria Harlow became Victoria Daniels. The church was filled with Carson City's most respected citizens, the governor included. Sheriff Thompson and a good many folks from Humboldt came to see her married. When Ethan made his vows, his voice was steady as stone, and his eyes never left Victoria. He promised to love and protect her, and everyone who knew their story knew it was a promise he had already proven he would keep. At the reception, their joy was plain for anyone to see. "You look absolutely radiant, Mrs. Daniels," a surprised Clayton Jeff told her, "and the chief marshal is one lucky man." "I am the lucky one, Mr. Jeff," Victoria replied, her eyes finding Ethan across the room. Later, as the sun began to set, the newlyweds disappeared. They did not head for a big city, but for that special cabin in the mountains. This time they went without fear or chaperones, just a sure future ahead of them. Inside, everything was prepared for a week away from the world, including a note from the governor giving Ethan 2 full weeks off. Ethan lifted Victoria and carried her inside. The cabin was no longer a shelter from harm, but a haven where their real life together could begin. "Welcome home, Mrs. Daniels," he said softly, keeping her close. She looked up at the man who was now her husband. "This feels so right, being here where our story truly began." Ethan nodded. His touch was gentle on her cheek. "We made it all the way around, have we not? From fear to safety, from danger to peace." She rose to kiss him and added, "From strangers to man and wife." Later that night, Victoria rested her head on Ethan's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Their path had been hard, but she would walk it all over again to find him. "What are you thinking about?" he whispered. She smiled in the dark. "About fate. How the very worst day of my life led me right to the very best one." His arms tightened around her. "If those men had not taken you, if I was not already on their trail." "We might have never met," she finished. "I highly doubt that," Ethan said, his voice quiet but sure. "Some things are just meant to be, Victoria. I believe I would have found you one way or another." "Window. Do you really think that? That we were fated to be together?" Ethan mulled that over for a moment, like he always did. "I reckon we make our own way in this world, but I'll tell you what, sometimes folks' paths are just meant to cross. The day I first laid eyes on you, something deep inside me just knew. It was like finding a piece of my own soul I never knew was missing." Victoria felt the truth of his words clear down to her bones. This was her Ethan, the man behind the stoic marshal's badge. "I felt it too," she said softly. "Scared as I was, I knew you weren't like any man I'd ever met before." He pulled her into a kiss that said more than words ever could. "I love you, Victoria Daniels," he whispered, "now and forever." "And I love you," she answered, her heart nearly bursting with joy. Their story became a legend in the Nevada territory. How the tough marshal rescued his future wife, shielded her from a powerful man's wrath, and won her heart for good. Their mountain cabin was their sanctuary, the place they always came back to as their family grew. Ethan served as chief marshal with honor until Nevada became a state. Then he hung up his guns for good and took a seat on the state Supreme Court, serving justice with a gavel instead. Meanwhile, Victoria opened a school for young ladies in Carson City. She taught them more than just sewing and sitting pretty. She taught them bookkeeping and how to defend themselves, skills a woman truly needed out here. They raised two strong boys and a girl. Their oldest son followed his daddy into law, while the younger one became a doctor. And their daughter, with her mama's fire and her daddy's sense of right and wrong, became one of the first female lawyers in all of Nevada. James Harlow got to see all three of his grandkids grow up, spending his golden years surrounded by family and the satisfaction of helping build the new state. On their 25th anniversary, Ethan brought Victoria back to the cabin. They sat on that porch, watching a sunset that looked just like the one they'd seen the day he asked for her hand. 25 years, she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Sometimes it feels like yesterday you were cutting those ropes off my wrists. Other times it feels like we've been together for 100 years. Ethan's arm held her tight. "Best thing I ever did, following those tracks." He kissed her hair. "My second best decision was asking you to marry me." Victoria let out a happy laugh. "And all it took was a kidnapping, a gunfight, and a big trial to get us here. Most folks just meet at a town social." Ethan chuckled, a low rumble she knew so well. "We never have been ones for the easy way, have we?" "No," she agreed, turning her face up to his. "But I wouldn't change a single blessed thing." As the sun finally dipped low behind the mountains, painting the sky all orange and gold, Victoria thought about the long road she'd traveled. She'd gone from a terrified girl tied up in a wagon to a wife, a mother, and a woman the whole town looked up to. The trail wasn't always smooth, but it led her right here, into the arms of the man who didn't just save her life. He gave her a life worth living. And when you get right down to it, that was a love story worth telling to your children, and your children's children. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.